Back, and we are continuing a really important conversation, one of the most important I've had, I think, with our friend and colleague Sam Faddis. He's talking to us about China. And I wanted to broaden the lens a bit from the enemy within problem that we were discussing, the CCP groomers and the people engaged in economic treason and other efforts on behalf of our mortal enemy to destroy us from within. To take a look with you, Sam, at something that you've written about in your Substack column, as I recall, about how China can strangle the world. Talk about, well, among other things, the choke points around the world and the Belt and Road Initiative that has given them perhaps a dominant position in just about all of them.
Well, it probably is a product of what we were just talking about, which is the extent to which the Chinese have co-opted our elite. We don't seem to have any sort of coherent strategic geopolitical strategy. I mean, to the extent we have one, it's can certain people make a lot of money as quickly as possible off of doing business with the Chinese in terms of advancing the interests of the country? Nothing. The Chinese, as you well know, look at this and I was going to say long term, but that implies that it's not an immediate threat. They look at it in a much more broader, more strategic, more coherent way. So let's look at energy and trade, but first and foremost, energy, right? If you can cut off the flow of energy, if you can control energy, you control the world, right? I mean, oil has been what we've thought about most in that regard for a long time, but it remains so, but it could be any form of energy. So the Chinese have just spent a good decade, more than a decade, building a whole series of artificial islands in the South China Sea, and we have now acknowledged that they are fully militarized. So these are not just sandcastles out in the South China Sea. They have taken one of the world's most strategic waterways, and they have put themselves in a position with aircraft and missiles and military forces that are now there to control that waterway. So
On islands that they have basically built out of nothing. I mean, essentially atolls, and
yes.
as have turned into bastions, as you say, heavily armed bastions, despite promises made to the Obama Biden
Absolutely.
team that they wouldn't do that.
Right.
Shockingly.
Well, Joe, since that was Joe's portfolio when he was vice president, we understand why that didn't happen.
Yeah. Well,
But these are
back to
not
elite capture, doesn't it? Yeah.
precisely. These are not just sandcastles or them sticking a flag in something and self satisfaction. No, these are fully militarized and as our military leaders have said, offensive platforms. So the Chinese are now in a position to control all trade through that waterway and start looking at how much oil moves to Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, all of East Asia through that waterway. If you shut off trade, you've effectively killed Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan. Not content with that, they now, of course, have a 25-year alliance with the Iranians. They have access to port facilities already. Apparently, they have permission to bring in up to 5,000 troops and build their own base. And as we've noted, all of a sudden the Iranians are making all kinds of threats at the Strait of Hormuz against people like the South Koreans, saying if they don't do what they tell them to do, they will shut off the flow of oil. Again, one of those waterways. Almost all the Mideast oil moves out of the Strait of Hormuz, right? I mean, some of it moves by pipeline, but relatively small. So if you shut the Strait of Hormuz, again, you've killed the economies of half the world methodically. You mentioned Belt and Road Initiative, same thing, methodically taking control.
Red Sea, the Caribbean, the Panama Canal. There's some
Absolutely.
talk that they may grab the Azores as well. All of them, again, strategic waterways um, that East Africa that can become, in their respective fashions, choke points for trade, choke points for, among other things, the movement of our military forces if we need to defend us or allies of great national interests. So, Sam, you put all this together with supply chains, which the Chinese have also come to dominate, and you start getting an impression that that for want of a better term, long term plan with immediate implications, to be sure, is very far advanced indeed. I was struck. We did a study for the Committee on the Present Danger of China back in July, I think, of last year about the Belt and Road Initiative. 145 countries, as I recall, out of something like 190 are already in some form or fashion hooked up with this thing. Talk a little bit about the supply chain piece of this and how that's now becoming more and more evidently a disastrous problem arising again from this policy of engaging and enabling the Chinese Communist Party.
Sure. Well, if you think about supply chains, look, we have made ourselves effectively completely reliant upon the Chinese, right? To the point where we talk about now during the age of COVID, we don't produce even the most basic pharmaceuticals that we need. So you're going to go to war with the Chinese, but you can't produce medications and antibiotics that you need to fight that war. If we can't get components from Taiwan, which the Chinese can cut off the flow of anytime, our entire automobile industry comes to a stop. Energy, every component. Now Joe wants to move us to the Green New Deal, which will be completely dependent upon rare earth minerals, the supply of which is 90% under the control of the Chinese. You start adding all of this up, and pretty soon you realize that we are, can basically at the flip of a switch almost be just brought to your knees. What are you going to respond with? Nothing.
And this is a byproduct, a absolutely predictable byproduct of the policy of engagement that said it doesn't matter where stuff comes from. We can actually take factories from America and transfer them literally in some cases, certainly the work of them to China, and it'll make more money for us because the labor can be exploited at a fraction of the cost of what would be paid here. In addition to all of that, Sam, there's another phenomenon that is, I think, particularly urgent and in need of attention, and that is a practice that we got a taste of early in the COVID pandemic, the CCP virus, namely the hoarding by China of critical gear. In that case, it was personal protective equipment. In the present moment, it appears that they are doing substantial hoarding of food. And as it happens, at a time when they have been buying up both some of our food producers, we've seen them buying up agricultural land in our country. And oh, by the way, and maybe it's a coincidence, I'm told something like 7 different food production factories in our country have mysteriously, purely coincidentally, I'm sure, had fires in the past month or two. You put all this together, Sam, are we likely to discover that something as absolutely necessary as foodstuffs may also be a supply chain disaster in the making?
Yeah, without question. Of course, this is all occurring against the backdrop of everything associated with the Ukraine conflict that has made this situation much more dire. Russians are not exporting fertilizer. Half the world isn't going to fertilize its crops, so that crop yield is going to go plummet. I read something earlier today, something like 1/3 of the cropland in Ukraine will not be planted for wheat this year. So we got all of this, everything stretched thin, and we got the Chinese grabbing control. I mean, to me, Frank, if you look at this overall policy that we're pursuing with the Chinese, it is a suicidal policy, right? At every level, you are handing your enemy the capacity to destroy you, and you just keep doing it. It is
You keep
predictable.
doing it is the key point. Sam, that's got to stop. So if it
Yes.
happens, so do we. Thank you so much, my friend, for your time today. We'll talk with you again next week, God willing. And in the meantime, keep up that tremendous work you do at And Magazine and Substack. We're going to talk next with Mike McCormick about the Biden he knew in the vice presidency and is reporting on now as president of the United States. It's not pretty. Stay tuned.